Rich man impregnates homeless woman, but what happened next left him in tears. The light rain slid down the imposing windows of John Reynolds' office. The sound of raindrops, as steady as the ticking of the wall clock, created an unsettling melody. The environment was impeccable, like everything John owned. The smell of leather from the armchairs mixed with the faint aroma of freshly brewed coffee. That morning, the world seemed to be following its usual course, until the sound of the mansion's doorbell echoed through the halls. One of the house staff approached with firm steps, holding a letter sealed with the Reynolds family's wax emblem. As he handed it over, his glance was brief but filled with curiosity. John stared at the envelope, recognizing the family crest with a look of suspicion. He knew that anything bearing that seal rarely came with good news. He sat in his black leather armchair and, with a precise cut, broke the seal. Pulling out the sheet of beige paper, his heart rate quickened. The handwriting was unmistakable, strong, meticulous, just like the man who had led the family with an iron will for decades. "John, if you're reading this letter, it means my journey in this world has come to an end." Those words made John take a deep breath. He closed his eyes for a moment, pressing his thumb against his temple. His grandfather, Mr. Charles Reynolds, had always been an imposing figure. A man who never asked, he commanded. Even after death, he still found a way to control the pieces on the board. He continued reading, his jaw tightening. "I know that throughout your life, you've always sought control over everything around you. The Reynolds empire that we built together requires vision, but it also requires something you have yet to understand: legacy. So, here is my final order." John's eyes narrowed. He knew old Charles would never make things simple. And he was right. "You and your cousin Ethan will be put to the test. The one who brings an heir into the world first will receive my entire fortune, along with the presidency of the board of directors. You two have always competed, but this time, the contest will be for what truly matters: the continuation of the Reynolds bloodline." John let the paper fall onto the table. His trembling hand rested over his mouth as he released a sarcastic, disbelieving laugh. "A child. He wants me to have a child," he muttered, staring into space. His eyes shifted toward the reflection in the window, where he could see himself. His perfectly tailored suit, his slick-back hair, the man everyone respected and feared. But for the first time, he felt like a pawn in a game he didn't control. "Damn old man," he muttered, lowering his head. At 36, John Reynolds was the portrait of success. He ran a network of luxury car dealerships across the United States and Canada. He was surrounded by luxury, parties, and people who said yes to his every command. But children? Family? Those words had always seemed distant. His only real family had been Mr. Charles, the man who, even after death, continued to dictate the rules of his life. His phone vibrated on the table. A notification. Ethan's name flashed on the screen. "Message from Ethan, I assume you got the letter. May the best man win, cousin. I never lose." John's blood boiled. Ethan had always been the provocateur, the cousin who sought the spotlight, the man who would do anything to win. They had grown up together, but they were never friends. Ethan always knew how to push John's buttons, and now, he was one step ahead. John slammed his fist on the table, the sound echoing through the office. He stood up, walked over to the window, and gazed at the city below. People ran with umbrellas open, trying to protect themselves from the rain, while he felt trapped in a personal storm. How could he fulfill such an absurd demand? Marriage? A child? He barely had time for lunch, let alone to build a family. Arranged marriages were common among the wealthy, but he knew that would mean giving up his freedom, something he had never been willing to do. An idea crossed his mind. It wasn't immediate, but it came like a whisper, a spark that, little by little, grew into a blaze. His eyes, once clouded with confusion, now focused with sharp precision. He didn't need to follow the traditional path. He needed to be smarter. Faster. He grabbed his phone, dialed a number, and with a firm tone, said, "Get the car ready. Now." On his way to the garage, John adjusted his suit and ran a hand through his hair, trying to regain his composure. In the elevator, he stared at his reflection and, with a cold smile, said to himself, "If the old man wants an heir, he'll get one. But on my terms." The elevator doors opened, and within seconds, he was in the back seat of his sleek black Aston Martin DB11. The engine roared as the car slid smoothly through the rain-soaked streets of New York. His eyes scanned the landscape, but his mind was racing. He knew he needed a creative solution, a way to bend the rules. A child. It didn't have to be complicated. It had to be efficient. Through the rain, as the red and yellow traffic lights reflected on the wet pavement, John muttered to himself, "You taught me to win, Grandpa. Now watch me." The rain had eased, but the streets of New York were still wet, reflecting the city's dazzling lights like a fragmented mosaic. The Aston Martin DB11 sliced through the traffic with precision, its black body gliding past yellow cabs and hurried pedestrians. Inside, John Reynolds sat in silence, his gaze sharp, his mind sharper. His fingers tapped rhythmically on his knee, matching the beat of his thoughts. He didn't know the exact plan yet, but one thing was clear: he wasn't going to lose to Ethan. The car slowed as they approached a red light. John's eyes drifted toward the sidewalk. Among the sea of rushing strangers, one figure stood still. A woman, alone, soaked from head to toe, hugging her coat tightly around a swollen belly. Her head was down, hair drenched and clinging to her face. She wasn't running for shelter like the others. She was just there. His brows furrowed. There was something about her stillness that drew his attention. "Stop the car," John said abruptly. The driver glanced at him through the rearview mirror, hesitating for a moment. "Sir, are you sure? This is Midtown, and—" "Stop the car," John repeated, his voice firmer this time. The car came to a halt at the curb. John leaned forward, his gaze fixed on the woman. She hadn't moved. Her eyes were locked on the ground, her hands gently cradling her pregnant belly. A part of him told him to keep driving, she wasn't his problem. But something deeper, something primal, wouldn't let him look away. He lowered the window, letting in the cold, humid air. "Hey," he called out. No reaction. She didn't even flinch. His jaw tightened. "Hey. You," he called louder this time. Slowly, she raised her head, her eyes meeting his. Her gaze was sharp but tired, like someone who had seen too much in too little time. Her face was young but worn, cheeks hollowed from exhaustion. Her lips were pale, and water dripped from her hair like tiny rivers. John tilted his head, his eyes narrowing in calculation. "Get in," he said, his voice low but commanding. Her eyes darted around, cautious, like a wild animal unsure if it was being offered food or a trap. She clutched her belly protectively. "Why?" she shot back, her voice hoarse from the cold. John leaned his elbow on the door frame, letting out a slow breath. "You're soaked. Freezing. And pregnant." He gestured to the open car door. "You can stand there all night or you can be warm in here. Your choice." Her lips pressed together in hesitation. Her eyes flickered between him, the driver, and the warm leather seats inside the car. "Not interested," she muttered, turning her back to him. John's patience wore thin. The cold, the rain, the pressure of the will, Ethan's smug message, it all boiled over. "Don't be stupid," he snapped. "You think people on this street care about you? They'll walk past you like you're invisible. You want to be strong? Fine. But strength doesn't mean freezing to death on a sidewalk." That made her stop. She glanced over her shoulder, her eyes locked on his face. Slowly, she turned to face him. Her gaze was fierce now, defiant. And what do you want from me, huh? She challenged, narrowing her eyes. Rich guys like you don't do charity. John's eyes darkened. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The sounds of the city filled the silence, honking horns, distant sirens, the rhythmic splash of tires against wet pavement. Maybe I'm not feeling like a rich guy today, he replied, his tone sharper than before. They stared at each other, like two predators sizing each other up. Then, slowly, she took a step forward. Another step. Her eyes stayed on him, still cautious, still searching for a catch. Finally, she reached the car door. Fine, she said. But if you try anything, I'll scream so loud this whole street will hear. John's lips curved into a faint, amused smile. Noted. She slid into the seat across from him, still dripping wet. Her fingers rubbed her arms, trying to summon warmth from her soaked clothes. Her eyes flickered to him, her gaze sharp as ever. She wasn't the type to relax just because she was inside a luxury car. John pressed a button, and the window rose slowly, cutting off the outside world. The warmth of the car's heating system washed over them. What's your name? He asked, his voice calm but direct. Sarah, she replied, eyes still on him. Sarah what? She hesitated. Sarah Thompson. Where are you from, Sarah Thompson? Does it matter? She shot back, her eyes locking with his. He tilted his head, acknowledging her defiance. No. Not really. They sat in silence for a moment. Her fingers continued to rub her arms, her eyes scanning the interior of the car. She was taking it all in, the leather seats, the scent of wealth, the quiet hum of luxury. You homeless? He asked bluntly. Her eyes darted to him, sharp as a knife. You always this polite? John's lips curled into a small grin. Only on rainy days. Her eyes softened for a fraction of a second, a flicker of exhaustion passing through her face. Yeah. I'm homeless, she admitted, eyes dropping to her belly. Not like I planned it, though. John watched her carefully. His eyes lingered on her belly, then shifted back to her face. Something clicked in his mind. How far along are you? 7 months, she replied, voice quieter now. Silence settled over them. The driver glanced at them through the rearview mirror but said nothing. John tapped his finger on the leather seat, eyes narrowing as his thoughts pieced themselves together. 7 months. Homeless. Alone. His gaze hardened with resolve. Sarah, he said, his voice calm but firm. She glanced at him cautiously. I have a proposition for you. Her eyes narrowed. Yeah, I bet you do. It's not what you think, he said quickly. I'm not asking for anything like that. Then what do you want? She asked, folding her arms over her belly. John leaned forward, his gaze intense. You're having a baby. I need one. He paused, letting his words sink in. We can help each other. Her eyes widened in shock. Her lips parted, but no words came out. She blinked, staring at him like he'd just spoken in a foreign language. You're insane, she finally said, shaking her head. I don't even know you. You don't have to, he replied, voice unwavering. I'll give you shelter. Food. Clothes. Medical care. Whatever you need for you and that baby. In exchange, I'll claim the child as mine. Her breath hitched. She stared at him, frozen between disbelief and confusion. Why would you do that? She asked, her voice laced with suspicion. John leaned back, running his tongue across his teeth, eyes sharp as ever. Because I have something to win. And you, he nodded toward her belly, you have something I need. Her jaw clenched. Her eyes searched his face for any sign of deceit, but all she saw was cold, hard determination. Her hands instinctively cradled her belly. That baby stays with me, she said firmly, eyes burning with resolve. John raised an eyebrow. The baby stays with you. But, legally, it stays with me. Her breathing grew heavier. She shook her head, biting her lip, her eyes filling with doubt and fear. I'll give you a place to live, he pressed on, his voice smooth like a negotiator closing a billion-dollar deal. No more cold nights. No more rain. You win. I win. Her eyes stayed locked on his for what felt like an eternity. Finally, she lowered her gaze to her belly, her fingers tracing slow circles over it. Food, too? She asked softly, still looking down. Food. Clothes. Everything, John replied without hesitation. Another pause. Her fingers stopped moving. She looked up, eyes filled with a mix of resignation and resolve. Deal, she said quietly. John leaned back, arms crossed, eyes unwavering. Good choice, he muttered. The engine roared to life. The rain outside continued to fall, but inside the car, two strangers had just made a pact that would change both their lives forever. The Aston Martin glided smoothly through the rain-soaked streets, its powerful engine purring like a predator at rest. Inside, the air was thick with unspoken tension. The warmth of the car's heating system was a stark contrast to the cold world Sarah had just left behind. She sat stiffly, her back pressed against the leather seat, her arms wrapped protectively around her belly. Her gaze darted to the window, watching the city lights blur into glowing streaks as they sped through the streets. Every now and then, her eyes flickered to John, but she didn't say a word. She was still trying to figure him out. John sat across from her, legs crossed, eyes locked on her face. He wasn't a man who liked silence, but this silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was strategy. He watched her like a chess player studying his opponent's next move. You're quiet, he said, his voice calm but sharp. Sarah glanced at him, her eyes narrowing. I'm thinking. About what? He asked, tilting his head slightly. About how people like you don't offer something for nothing, she replied bluntly. John's lips tugged into a faint smirk. Smart. But I didn't say I was offering something for nothing. I was clear. We both get something out of this. Her eyes stayed on him, unwavering. You get a fake kid. I get a bed and a meal. Sounds like a pretty one-sided deal, don't you think? John's gaze didn't falter. A bed, meals, clothes, medical care, security, and protection from every drunk, scammer, and creep that sees a homeless pregnant woman as an easy target. He leaned forward slightly, his eyes colder now. Or you can walk away. Go back to sleeping on sidewalks, hoping someone tosses you $1 for coffee. Sarah clenched her jaw, her fingers tracing slow, deliberate circles over her belly. She hated that he was right. She hated even more that he knew it. What's stopping you from kicking me out after the baby's born? She asked, her voice low but firm. John's eyes locked with hers. Nothing, he admitted without hesitation. But I'm not stupid. A deal like this works both ways. You want security, I want results. As long as you hold up your end, I hold up mine. Her brows drew together in suspicion. And if I don't? John leaned back, his eyes narrowing into slits. Then you lose everything I'm offering. Simple as that. Her heart thudded in her chest. No bluff. No hesitation. No cracks in his voice. This man played with power the way people play with dice. Sarah knew his type, men who always got what they wanted. But she wasn't powerless. She had one thing he needed. You want my baby, she said slowly, testing the weight of her own words. John's eyes flickered to her belly, then back to her face. I want an heir. There's a difference. Silence fell again, but this time it was heavier. Sarah's fingers stopped moving over her belly, her eyes drifting down as if she were counting each breath. Her options were limited, and they both knew it. She could walk away, but walk where? To another alley? To another shelter that would kick her out in 3 days? Her baby deserved more than that. Fine, she said finally, her voice steadier than before. Her eyes lifted to meet his. But I have conditions. John raised an eyebrow, clearly amused. Conditions? Yeah, she shot back. I'm not some pawn in your billionaire game, Reynolds. You think you're offering me everything, but I'm offering you something too. You want me to play along? Then I get a say. He leaned forward, eyes narrowing in curiosity. All right, Sarah Thompson. I'm listening. Her fingers tightened around her belly like she was ready to protect it from the world. Her gaze didn't waver. First, she said, her voice cutting like glass, the baby stays with me. No secret adoptions. No tricks. No lawyers showing up with papers I accidentally signed. The baby is mine. John tilted his head but didn't interrupt. Second, she continued, I'm not just a pretty face to parade around in front of your fancy friends. If you expect me to live in your world, I get treated like a person, not a prop. John's eyes flickered with something between surprise and respect. And third, she said, leaning forward slightly, her eyes locked with his, if you want me to lie for you, you better keep your end of the deal. No games. No double-crossing me just because you can. You break your word, and I walk. A slow smile spread across John's face, a look of genuine amusement. You really think you're in a position to bargain? I think you need me more than I need you, she replied, her eyes blazing with defiance. Silence. A long, heavy silence. But then, slowly, John started to laugh. It wasn't loud, but it was real. He leaned back against the seat, eyes fixed on her like he'd just discovered something fascinating. All right, Sarah Thompson, he said, still chuckling softly. You've got guts. I respect that. He glanced out the window for a moment, watching the raindrops trail down the glass. Then he looked back at her, eyes sharp as a blade. Deal, he said simply. Her breath hitched, like she didn't expect him to agree so easily. That's it? Just like that? John leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. His eyes were locked on hers, his smile gone now. I don't waste time. You'll learn that about me. He tapped the glass divider between them and the driver. Take us to Madison Park Tower. Call ahead to prepare a room. Full service. Yes, sir, the driver replied, and the car shifted direction. Madison Park Tower? Sarah asked, suspicion filling her voice. Temporary stay, John replied, his eyes back on her. You'll be staying at my place after that. But first, you're getting cleaned up. I'm not introducing you to my world looking like a stray cat. Her eyes narrowed at him, but she didn't argue. He wasn't wrong. She glanced down at her soaked hoodie and stained jeans, her lips tightening with quiet frustration. She didn't need him to remind her of what she looked like. The city lights passed by like ghosts, flashes of red, gold, and blue flickering across her face. She watched them, her eyes distant, her fingers still resting on her belly. You know this won't end well for you, right? She muttered, not looking at him. John glanced at her, his gaze sharp and unyielding. You think so? I know so, she replied, finally turning her head to face him. People like you think you're untouchable. But when you play with people like me, you never see it coming when it all burns down. His lips curled into a smirk. I never lose, Sarah. She raised an eyebrow, eyes filled with something that looked like pity. Neither did I, she muttered softly, turning back to the window. Neither of them said another word. The Aston Martin pulled into the underground parking garage of Madison Park Tower. Security guards straightened their postures the moment they saw the car, recognizing its owner immediately. John opened the door himself, stepping out into the dimly lit garage with the confidence of a king in his castle. He turned, eyes locked on Sarah. "Come on," he said. "Your new life starts now." Her eyes met his, steady and unblinking. Slowly, she swung her legs out of the car, planting her feet on the concrete. "Don't forget, Reynolds," she said, standing to her full height, her eyes sharp and unafraid. "It's our new life." John's smile returned, slow and dangerous. "We'll see, Sarah." They walked side by side toward the elevator, two strangers bound by a deal that neither of them fully trusted. The metal doors slid open, and they stepped inside. For a moment, they stood in silence. The lights above them flickered once, then glowed steady. As the elevator began to rise, neither of them spoke. They didn't have to. Each of them knew they had just stepped into something much bigger than a deal. And neither of them was prepared to lose. The quiet hum of the elevator filled the space, a soft mechanical whisper as it ascended floor after floor. Sarah leaned against the wall, her arms crossed, eyes fixed on the illuminated numbers slowly ticking upward. She glanced at John from the corner of her eye. He stood next to her, perfectly still, his hands in his pockets, his gaze fixed straight ahead. Unbothered. Unshaken. The silence between them was heavy but not awkward. It was the kind of silence that only exists between two people who both know they're playing a game, and neither one intends to lose. Ding! The elevator doors slid open with a soft chime, revealing a lavish hallway lined with cream-colored marble floors and modern black and gold accents. Plush rugs stretched down the corridor, muffling their footsteps as they walked. Large abstract paintings hung on the walls, each one looking like it had been bought at an exclusive auction for an obscene amount of money. John led the way with long, purposeful strides. He didn't check to see if Sarah was following, he knew she would. Her gaze wandered, taking in every inch of the space. It wasn't just luxury, it was wealth in its purest form. Wealth so vast it didn't have to prove itself. The kind of wealth that whispered instead of shouted. "Don't stare too hard," John said without looking back. "You'll get used to it." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "Doubt it," she muttered. They reached the end of the hall, where a large black door with a gold handle awaited. John placed his hand on a fingerprint scanner. A soft beep sounded, and the door clicked open. "Welcome to your new home," he said, pushing the door wide. The sight before her stopped Sarah in her tracks. The penthouse was a sprawling masterpiece of modern architecture. Floor-to-ceiling windows revealed a panoramic view of New York City's skyline. The rain had stopped, and the city lights shimmered like tiny stars scattered across the horizon. The living room was vast, with a large white sectional sofa that could seat at least 10 people. A sleek, black marble fireplace sat along the far wall, and an enormous flat-screen television hung above it. To the left, a kitchen that looked like it had never been used gleamed under warm recessed lighting. Stainless steel appliances, pristine countertops, and bar stools with leather seats lined the kitchen island. Everything was spotless, like a magazine spread come to life. Her eyes widened as she stepped inside. Her sneakers squeaked slightly against the polished wood floors. She paused, feeling suddenly out of place. Her damp hoodie clung to her back, her jeans still wet from the rain. She felt like a smudge on a perfect, untouched canvas. "It's bigger than I expected," she said softly, her eyes still scanning every corner. "Bigger than the sidewalk, too," John quipped, taking off his suit jacket and tossing it onto the back of the sofa. Sarah shot him a glare, her eyes sharp with irritation. "Yeah, thanks for that reminder, boss." John smirked but didn't reply. Instead, he rolled up the sleeves of his crisp white shirt, revealing his forearms, strong and marked with faint lines of veins. He walked over to the kitchen, opened a cabinet, and pulled out a bottle of whiskey. He poured himself a glass, moving with the precision of someone who'd done it 1,000 times before. "Want something?" he asked, glancing at her over his shoulder. "Yeah," she shot back, kicking off her wet sneakers. "A shower. And dry clothes. Unless you plan on showing me around looking like this." John sipped his whiskey, his eyes fixed on her with a quiet amusement. "Straight down the hall. Third door on the left. There's a closet with clothes that should fit. Women come and go from here all the time. You'll find something." Her gaze sharpened. "Charming." "Honest," he corrected, taking another sip. She stood there for a moment longer, watching him like she was waiting for him to blink first. But he didn't. He never did. With a small shake of her head, she grabbed her backpack from the floor and started walking toward the hallway. Her steps echoed as she moved, her wet socks squishing softly against the wooden floors. "Third door on the left," she muttered to herself. She passed 2 closed doors, each one with a sleek, minimalist design. No labels. No signs. Just cold, perfect surfaces. When she reached the third door, she hesitated for a second, her hand hovering over the handle. For a brief moment, doubt crept in. "What am I doing here?" she thought. "This man could be a psycho for all I know." But then she glanced down at her belly. Her fingers pressed gently against it, feeling the faintest little flutter from within. Her baby. Her reason for everything. Her jaw tightened. She turned the handle. Inside, the bathroom looked like something pulled from a luxury resort brochure. White marble floors, gold accents, a walk-in rain shower with glass walls, and a soaking tub big enough for 3 people. Fluffy white towels were neatly folded on a heated rack, and a basket of bath products sat by the sink. It smelled faintly of eucalyptus and cedar. "Okay," she whispered to herself, exhaling slowly. "This is different." She dropped her backpack to the floor and peeled off her wet hoodie, her fingers numb from the cold. Her jeans followed, landing in a pile with a soggy thud. Her reflection in the mirror caught her eye, and she froze. She looked at herself for the first time in a while. Really looked. Her eyes had dark circles beneath them. Her cheeks were hollow. Her hair hung in tangled, wet strands around her face. She lifted her gaze to meet her own eyes in the mirror, and for a second, she saw herself as she was. Not the version of her that fought every day to survive. Just her. "You're stronger than this," she thought. "You've been through worse. You can get through this too." Her hands moved on instinct, turning on the shower. The hot water burst from the rainfall showerhead, steam rising instantly. She stepped in, tilting her head back, letting the warmth cascade over her. Her eyes closed, and for the first time in what felt like months, her body relaxed. Her muscles unwound. Her breath slowed. The world outside the glass walls of the shower didn't exist. Just the warmth. Just the quiet. Meanwhile, back in the living room, John stood by the window, glass of whiskey in hand. The lights of New York reflected off the glass, casting faint shadows across his face. He watched the skyline, his expression unreadable. His phone buzzed in his pocket. Slowly, he pulled it out and glanced at the screen. Message from Ethan, "Heard you're playing house. Careful, cousin. Attachments make you weak." John's jaw clenched as he read the message. Slowly, he typed a response. "You should worry about your own game, Ethan. I'm already 5 moves ahead." He hit send and slipped the phone back into his pocket, his gaze still locked on the city lights. His eyes reflected something sharp, something cold. He didn't believe in attachments. Attachments got people killed. But he believed in strategy. He glanced toward the hallway, where Sarah had disappeared. He didn't trust her. He didn't trust anyone. But he didn't have to trust her to use her. Trust was for the weak. Deals were for the strong. John took another slow sip of his whiskey, his eyes never leaving the city beyond the glass. The rain had stopped, but the storm was just beginning. The sound of the rain had long faded, replaced by the distant hum of city traffic below. The warmth of the penthouse was undeniable, but for Sarah, it still felt like she didn't belong. She stood in front of the closet, towel wrapped around her body, water still dripping from the tips of her hair. Her eyes scanned the racks of clothes, fingers brushing against fabrics so soft she almost didn't recognize them as real. Silks. Cashmeres. Designer labels she had only seen in glossy magazines discarded on subway seats. Her fingers paused on a simple gray sweater. Soft, thick, and warm. No flashy logos, no unnecessary details, just clean and simple. She pulled it off the hanger and found a pair of black leggings folded neatly on one of the shelves below. Practical. Comfortable. Once she was dressed, she rubbed the towel through her hair, her eyes flicking to the mirror on the wall. She almost didn't recognize herself. Her face was clean, her hair free of knots for the first time in weeks. Her eyes looked sharper, more awake. But something still lingered. The look of someone who knew this wasn't permanent. It never was. Her fingers brushed against her belly again, a quiet reminder of why she was here. "This is for you, little one," she thought, taking a deep breath. "We'll play his game, but we'll play it smart." She folded her wet clothes into a ball and glanced around the pristine bathroom. No laundry hampers in sight. Of course not. Men like John Reynolds didn't do their own laundry. They had people for that. She tossed the wet bundle into a small linen basket near the door, figuring it would disappear by morning. When she stepped back into the hallway, she noticed it was quieter than before. The only sound was the soft hum of the air conditioning and the muffled city noise beyond the massive windows. Her eyes shifted left, then right. For a moment, she stood there, unsure of where to go. There were no footsteps, no movement. It was too quiet. She walked toward the living room, her steps light, her senses on high alert. The open space looked as grand as before, marble, leather, and wealth that didn't need to prove itself. But now, it felt emptier. She spotted John by the window, his silhouette framed by the glow of city lights. He stood with his back to her, one hand in his pocket, the other holding a glass of amber-colored whiskey. For a moment, she thought about walking quietly back to the room. But something about the way he stood there, perfectly still, made her stop. He wasn't looking at the city. He was watching it. Studying it. "You always stand like that when you're thinking, or is it just for show?" she asked, breaking the silence. John didn't turn immediately. His head tilted slightly, acknowledging her presence. "Observation is everything," he replied, his voice calm but sharp. "People think it's about talking. It's not. It's about watching. Listening." He finally glanced at her over his shoulder. His eyes flicked down to her clothes, lingering for half a second before meeting her gaze again. "Looks better on you than I expected." Her eyes narrowed. "Careful, Reynolds. You almost gave me a compliment." "Don't get used to it," he replied, taking a slow sip of his whiskey. Sarah walked toward the large sectional sofa, her eyes sweeping the room. Every inch of it looked untouchable, like one wrong step and she'd stain the perfection. She sat down slowly, testing the feel of the leather beneath her. It was soft. Too soft. Like the kind of softness you don't trust. Her eyes found John again. "So, what's the plan, boss? You gonna parade me around your friends and say, 'Look, everyone, I'm a family man now'?" John turned fully to face her, his expression unreadable. He swirled the whiskey in his glass, eyes fixed on the liquid as if it held answers. "No parades," he said simply. "I don't need to prove anything to anyone. Least of all my friends." He raised the glass to his lips, taking another slow sip. His eyes shifted to her, sharp as ever. But you will meet someone. Soon. Her brows lifted. Who? My grandfather, he said, watching her reaction closely. Her eyes flickered with confusion. Didn't you say he was dead? John's smirk was slow and deliberate. Not that grandfather. The other one. Charles Reynolds. The man who wrote that little clause that landed you here. Her heart skipped. She sat up straighter, eyes narrowing. He's still alive. Alive, sharp, and more manipulative than you can imagine, John said, walking toward her. He sat on the arm of the couch, his eyes locked on hers. If you think I'm bad, wait till you meet him. Her eyes stayed on him, searching for cracks in his mask, but there were none. Just stone-cold certainty. And what exactly am I supposed to do when I meet him? She asked, arms folding across her chest. Play the role, John said, his tone firm but calm. You're my fiancé now. We're having a baby. He needs to believe that. Her lips pressed into a thin line. You mean lie to a man who's apparently better at manipulation than you? Exactly, John replied without hesitation. He'll test you. He'll try to break you. But if you can convince him, you'll convince anyone. He leaned forward slightly, his eyes sharper now, more intense. Think you can handle that, Sarah? She tilted her head, lips curving into a small, dangerous smile. I've been lying to people to survive for years, Reynolds. This old man doesn't scare me. Good, John said with a nod. Because he'll be here tomorrow. Her smile faded. Tomorrow. First thing in the morning, he confirmed, standing up. He downed the rest of his whiskey in one smooth motion, then set the glass on the coffee table with a soft clink. We'll get you ready. Her eyes narrowed. What do you mean, get me ready? You'll need to look the part, John replied, walking toward the hallway. Not like you just stepped off the street. Careful, Reynolds, she called after him, leaning forward with a grin. You might make me too pretty, and then you'll have a whole different set of problems. He paused mid-step, glancing at her over his shoulder with that same infuriating smirk. I like problems I can control, Sarah. Her grin vanished as quickly as it had come. She watched him walk down the hall, his steps measured, his posture steady as if the world itself bent to his will. Her eyes followed him until he disappeared into one of the rooms. For a few moments, she just sat there, fingers drumming softly on the leather of the couch. Control, huh? She muttered to herself, leaning her head back against the cushions. We'll see who's controlling who. Her gaze drifted to the city skyline beyond the massive windows. Rain still clung to the glass, tiny beads of water slowly sliding down. Somewhere out there, in that massive city filled with strangers, she had fought to stay alive. And now she was here. But she knew better than anyone that safety was an illusion. Deals like this one always came with a cost. And she had a feeling John Reynolds hadn't shown her the full price yet. Her fingers pressed lightly against her belly. We'll play his game for now, baby, she thought to herself, closing her eyes for just a second. But when the time comes, we'll be ready to win. Her eyes opened slowly, sharp and clear. Her gaze wasn't on the skyline anymore. It was on the hallway where John had disappeared. Control, huh? She repeated softly, her eyes narrowing. We'll see. The rain had stopped, but the storm between them had only just begun. Morning light seeped through the enormous floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long golden streaks across the marble floors of the penthouse. The city outside was waking up, car horns blaring, distant sirens wailing, and the soft hum of traffic far below. But inside, it was still. Too still. Sarah sat at the kitchen island, her fingers wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee. Her eyes were locked on the window, but she wasn't looking at the skyline. She was thinking. Calculating. Her fingers tapped softly against the side of the cup, the steady rhythm matching the clock ticking faintly in the background. John's voice echoed in her head. "He'll be here tomorrow." Her jaw tightened. She'd barely slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she imagined the face of Charles Reynolds, this mythical figure who was supposedly worse than John. Her mind had painted him as a mixture of a ruthless CEO and an old-world king, ruling his empire with a crown of iron and cold eyes. Her eyes flicked to the clock on the wall. 8:45 a.m. Her foot tapped lightly against the floor, a steady, anxious rhythm. Every muscle in her body was tense. She hated waiting. Waiting was for prey. "Coffee's not gonna make him nicer," John's voice called out from behind her. She glanced over her shoulder to see him walking into the kitchen, hair still damp from a shower, his sleeves rolled up to his forearms. He moved like a man who didn't just own the space, he commanded it. His watch gleamed on his wrist, subtle but expensive, like everything about him. "Good morning to you too, sunshine," Sarah muttered, taking a sip of her coffee. John opened the fridge, pulled out a bottle of water, and twisted off the cap with one smooth motion. He didn't answer right away, just took a long drink while his eyes stayed on her, sharp and focused as ever. "You ready?" he asked, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. "Ready to meet your charming grandfather," she said, her tone dry as desert sand. "Absolutely. I'm sure he's a delight." John tilted his head slightly, his lips twitching into that half-smirk she was already starting to hate. "Delightful isn't the word I'd use." She set her cup down on the counter a little harder than necessary. "So what's the strategy, boss? You gonna tell him some fairy tale about how we met at a coffee shop and fell madly in love?" Her tone dripped with sarcasm, but her eyes stayed on him, waiting for his answer. John didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. "We tell him the truth. Most of it, at least." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "The truth?" He leaned against the counter, arms crossed, eyes locked on hers. "The truth sells better than any lie. We met by chance. You were struggling. I offered you help. We grew close. That's all he needs to know." Her eyes narrowed. "You're leaving out the part where you offered me a business deal instead of a relationship." John shrugged, his gaze unwavering. "Details. Details are everything, Reynolds," she said, leaning forward on her elbows, her eyes sharp as glass. "You think this old man won't pick up on that?" John's smirk faded slightly. He watched her in silence for a moment, his eyes calculating. He knew she was right. Charles Reynolds didn't miss details. "Then we sell it harder," he said simply. "You're not some pawn in this. You're part of the plan. Act like it." Her eyes didn't leave his. "I'm not acting." They stared at each other, the air between them taut like a wire about to snap. Finally, John pushed himself off the counter, breaking the tension. "Good," he said, walking toward the living room. "Then you'll do just fine." The words lingered like smoke in the air. Before Sarah could fire back, the sound of the elevator's soft chime echoed from the hallway. Both of them froze. Her heart jumped in her chest, and her eyes shot to John. He glanced at her, his expression calm but his eyes sharp with warning. "Showtime," he muttered. Her fingers curled into fists against the counter. "Breathe," she told herself. "Just breathe." Footsteps echoed from the hallway. Not one pair, two. Heavy, deliberate steps accompanied by the softer tap of leather soles. Then, he appeared. Charles Reynolds. He wasn't as tall as she'd expected, but somehow he still seemed big. His presence filled the room like smoke. He wore a dark gray suit, tailored to perfection, and a tie so neatly done it could have been drawn with a ruler. His silver hair was combed back, not a strand out of place. But it was his eyes that struck her. Icy blue. Cold. Calculating. The kind of eyes that see through you in one glance and tell you exactly where you're weak. Walking behind him, slightly to his right, was Ethan. Sarah's eyes narrowed as she recognized him from the photo John had shown her the night before. Ethan Reynolds, charming smile, perfect suit, and a face you wanted to punch after 5 minutes. His grin was too sharp, like he knew something you didn't. "John," Charles said, his voice as smooth as silk but with the weight of a hammer. His eyes shifted to Sarah, and for the first time, she felt them on her like a weight pressing against her chest. "And who is this?" John's expression didn't change. He stepped forward, his posture as steady as ever. "Grandfather, this is Sarah. My fiancée." Silence. Charles's eyes stayed on Sarah, studying her, dissecting her like a specimen under a microscope. She fought the urge to shift her weight or look away. She wouldn't give him that satisfaction. "Fiancé," Charles repeated, his lips curling into something that wasn't quite a smile. "How sudden." "Life moves fast, grandfather," John said, stepping beside Sarah. His hand touched her lower back briefly, a silent message. "Play along." Sarah tilted her head slightly, her lips curving into a small, polite smile. "Sometimes life doesn't wait for permission." Her voice was steady, calm. She didn't blink. Charles's eyes flicked to John, then back to her. He nodded slowly, but his smile didn't reach his eyes. "Bold words." "Bold times," she replied, still smiling. Ethan chuckled softly from behind, his hands in his pockets, eyes gleaming with amusement. Well, John. You work fast, huh?" He glanced at Sarah, eyes scanning her from head to toe. "Didn't think you'd go for this style." John's jaw tightened, but his smile remained. "You're still talking, Ethan. How unfortunate." Charles raised a hand, silencing both of them with a single gesture. He stepped forward, his eyes locked on Sarah. "Tell me, Sarah," he said softly, his voice calm but sharp. "What is it that you see in my grandson?" The room went quiet. Her heartbeat echoed in her ears. "Don't flinch. Don't think. Own it." Her eyes never left his. Her smile didn't falter. "I see a man who doesn't give up," she said slowly, her voice steady. "He's not easy to like. He's impossible to control. But if you stand close enough, you see it." She tilted her head, her eyes unwavering. "He fights. And I respect that." For the first time, Charles blinked. "Interesting answer," he said quietly. "Not the answer I expected." Sarah raised an eyebrow, folding her arms slowly. "That's because you expected me to be afraid of you." Ethan's grin faded. Charles's eyes flashed with something, surprise, maybe. John glanced at her, his eyes sharper than ever, his lips pressing into a thin line. He didn't expect that move from her, but he didn't hate it. Charles let out a short, low chuckle. "Bold, indeed." He glanced at John, his lips curling ever so slightly. "You've chosen a fiery one, boy. Let's see if she can keep burning." He turned, his hands clasped behind his back, walking toward the window. Ethan followed, but not before casting Sarah a look that promised trouble. Sarah let out a slow breath. Her eyes flicked to John, and he nodded once. "Well played." She stared at the back of Charles Reynolds, her eyes sharp as ever. "You're not the only one who knows how to play this game, old man." The silence after Charles Reynolds' departure was like the eye of a storm. The tension still lingered in the air, sharp and electric. Sarah sat at the kitchen island, her arms folded, eyes locked on the spot where Charles had stood just moments ago. Her heart was still racing, but she wouldn't let it show. Not now. Not after holding her own against a man who could crush people with a glance. She could feel John's eyes on her, watching her closely. Calculating. "You handled yourself better than I expected," John finally said, his tone neutral but with a hint of something else, respect, maybe. She turned her head toward him slowly, her face unreadable. That's because you expected me to break. John's eyes flickered with something she couldn't quite place. He leaned against the counter, his sleeves still rolled up, his forearms resting on the cool marble. Most people do, he said simply. She raised an eyebrow, her lips curling into a faint smirk. I'm not most people, Reynolds. No, he admitted, his eyes narrowing on her. You're not. Silence settled between them, but it wasn't the kind of silence that comes from peace. It was the silence of two people trying to figure out if they were allies or opponents. Sarah finally broke it. So, what now? Your grandfather didn't exactly roll out the red carpet. John exhaled deeply, his eyes drifting toward the large windows overlooking the city. His fingers tapped lightly against the counter. He's testing you. Watching. He'll circle like a hawk until he finds a crack. Sarah tilted her head, her eyes sharp. And what about you? Are you looking for cracks too? John's gaze shifted back to her, sharper now. I already know where yours are, Sarah. It's your kid. Her eyes darkened, her whole body stiffening like a string pulled too tight. Careful, she warned, her voice dangerously low. Relax, he said, his voice calm but firm. It's not a threat. It's a fact. People protect what they love. You love that baby, so I know exactly how to control you if I need to. Her jaw clenched so hard it ached, but she didn't look away. She leaned forward, eyes locked on his. Then maybe you should remember something, John. Her voice was quiet, steady, like the still air before a storm. A person with nothing to lose is dangerous. But a person with one thing to protect. They'll burn the world down. Her words lingered, thick and heavy like smoke. John didn't look away. His eyes stayed on hers, and for a second, it felt like they were standing on opposite sides of a battlefield, each one daring the other to move first. Noted, he said, his voice as cold as steel. The sound of footsteps echoed softly down the hall. Their heads turned at the same time. Ethan. He sauntered in like he owned the place, his smile as smug as ever, hands in his pockets. His suit was flawless, of course. Every inch of him screamed privilege, charm, and the kind of arrogance only money could buy. Wow, Ethan said, his eyes darting between John and Sarah. You two look cozy. He tilted his head, his grin growing wider. I didn't think I'd ever see you like this, John. Domestic life really suits you. John's jaw twitched, but his face stayed calm. Didn't think I'd see you this early, Ethan. Thought you'd be too busy counting the money you didn't earn. Touché, Ethan replied, letting out a short, fake laugh. He walked over to the bar, pulled out a bottle of sparkling water, and cracked it open like he owned the place. He took a long sip, eyes flicking to Sarah. So, Ethan said, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. You're the famous Sarah. Her eyes narrowed, already disliking him. And you're the annoying cousin, she shot back without hesitation. Ethan raised his eyebrows, clearly amused. Feisty. I like that. He leaned on the bar, his eyes running over her like he was assessing a new car. Gotta say, John, you surprised me. I didn't think you'd go for someone like her. Like her? Sarah echoed, tilting her head. What's that supposed to mean? Ethan smirked, taking another sip of his water. Just saying you're a little different from the usual. He eyed her clothes, the plain sweater and leggings. Less polished. Her eyes stayed on him, steady and sharp. Yeah, well, I'm not here to impress you, pretty boy. John snorted, his gaze flicking to Ethan. Careful, Ethan. You're talking to the woman who just stared down our grandfather and didn't flinch. Ethan raised his eyebrows, genuinely surprised for a moment. He let out a short laugh, shaking his head. Really? He looked back at Sarah, his grin wider now. Well, well. Maybe you do have some bite. Bite hard enough to leave scars, she said, leaning forward, her eyes locked on his like a predator watching prey. Want to see how deep? Ethan's grin froze for half a second before he forced out another laugh, waving a hand like it was all a joke. Easy, Tiger. I'm just here to say hello. Consider it said, John cut in, his voice sharp. He stepped forward, placing himself just slightly in front of Sarah, his eyes on Ethan. You've seen her. You've said hello. Now leave. Ethan raised his hands in mock surrender. All right. No need to get all territorial, cousin. Just making sure she's real and not another one of your little tricks. John's eyes flashed with something dangerous. Careful, Ethan. Ethan smiled, but there was no humor in it. He started backing away, his hand still raised. Relax, Johnny. We're family, remember? No need for threats. His eyes flicked to Sarah one last time, his grin sharp as a blade. See you around, Sarah. She didn't say a word. She just watched him leave, her eyes following him until he was gone. When the door clicked shut, John let out a slow breath, pinching the bridge of his nose. Your cousin's a real piece of work, Sarah muttered, crossing her arms. He's worse than that, John replied, his eyes still on the door. He's dangerous. She glanced at him. You sound worried. I'm not, he said flatly, turning back to face her. But you should be. Her brow furrowed. Why? John walked toward her, stopping close enough that she had to tilt her head to look up at him. His eyes were colder than usual. Because Ethan only cares about one thing, winning. And if he thinks you're the reason I'm ahead, he'll come for you. Her breath caught, but she didn't back down. Her eyes stayed locked on his. Let him try. John stared at her for a moment longer, his gaze searching her face like he was trying to figure out if she actually believed her own words. You think you're ready for this, he said softly, his voice quieter than before. But you're not. Her eyes didn't waver. Maybe not, she admitted. But I've been through worse than him. John didn't reply. He just watched her, his face still as stone. And then, slowly, he nodded. All right, he said, stepping back. But if you want to survive this, you'll need to be smarter than him. Her lips curved into a small, dangerous smile. Smarter than him, she repeated. Her eyes flicked toward the door Ethan had walked through. That won't be hard. John watched her with that same calculating look he always gave her, like she was a puzzle he hadn't quite solved. We'll see, he muttered. The storm outside had long since passed, but inside, the storm between them was just getting started. Night had fallen, and the glow of the city skyline seeped through the penthouse windows, casting long streaks of gold and blue light across the floor. The world outside was alive, horns blaring, engines roaring, and the distant buzz of sirens weaving through the symphony of New York's chaos. Inside, it was quiet. Too quiet. Sarah sat on the edge of the plush white sofa, her elbows on her knees, hands clasped in front of her face. Her gaze was fixed on a single spot on the floor, her mind far away. The lights from outside flickered across her face like firelight, her eyes distant but sharp. John was across from her, standing by the window with his back to her. His phone was in his hand, his thumb scrolling slowly, his face lit by the blue glow of the screen. His suit jacket was gone, his white dress shirt rolled up to his forearms. His stance was as firm as ever, feet planted, shoulders back, like nothing in the world could shake him. But Sarah had seen it. That moment, earlier that day, when Ethan mentioned another one of your little tricks. John hadn't reacted much, but Sarah had seen it. The tight clench of his jaw. The flicker in his eyes. It was brief, but it was there. And she didn't miss it. "You're quiet," John said without turning around. His voice was steady, calm. Too calm. "Thinking," she replied, her eyes still on the floor. He glanced over his shoulder, one eyebrow raised. "Careful with that. You might overheat." Her lips curled into a dry smile. "Funny. I thought the same thing about you." He huffed a short laugh, turning back to his phone. She watched him, her eyes sharp as ever. She'd learned long ago how to spot a man hiding something. And John Reynolds was hiding something. "Ethan got under your skin today," she said suddenly, her eyes still on him. John's thumb paused on the screen for a split second before he continued scrolling, as if her words had barely registered. But Sarah saw it. She always saw it. "He likes to talk," John replied casually, still not turning around. "That's all he's ever been good at." "Yeah," she said, leaning back on the couch, her eyes locked on his back. "But today it felt different. Like he knew something you didn't." John's hand stopped moving. He lowered the phone slowly, letting it hang loosely in his hand. For a moment, he just stood there, gazing out at the city lights. She watched the shift in his posture, the slight tension in his shoulders. "You're paranoid," he muttered, his voice quieter than before. "Paranoia keeps people alive," Sarah shot back, her tone sharp. "And from what I've seen, you're plenty paranoid yourself." John's jaw shifted, the muscles tightening. He finally turned to face her, his eyes locked on hers with that piercing, calculating gaze she was starting to recognize too well. He didn't speak right away. He just watched her, his eyes scanning her face like he was searching for cracks in her resolve. "You think you're clever, don't you?" he said, his voice low, controlled. She didn't flinch. Didn't blink. "I think I'm right." A slow, dangerous smile tugged at the corner of his lips. He moved toward her, slow, deliberate steps like a lion stalking prey. When he reached the edge of the coffee table, he leaned down slightly, his eyes level with hers. "Listen carefully, Sarah," he said, his voice so quiet it was almost a whisper. "If I were worried about Ethan, he wouldn't be walking around freely. Understand?" Her gaze didn't waver. She leaned forward, just enough to close the space between them. "If you weren't worried, you wouldn't have to say that out loud." His eyes flickered, just for a moment, but it was enough. Sarah leaned back, crossing her arms with a slow, satisfied smirk. "Yeah. Thought so." John straightened up, eyes narrowing on her like she was a chess piece that had just moved without his permission. She could feel it, the shift in his energy. The cold, calculated calm was cracking, and she was the one causing it. "You think you've got me figured out?" he asked, his voice darker now, more dangerous. "Not yet," she admitted, tilting her head. "But I'm close." John's eyes lingered on her, sharp and unblinking. He wasn't used to people talking to him like this. He wasn't used to losing control. His phone buzzed. He didn't look at it right away. His eyes stayed on her for another long, tense moment before he finally glanced down at the screen. His face hardened. "Problem?" Sarah asked, watching him closely. "Nothing I can't handle," John muttered, his fingers tapping rapidly across the screen. But the way his jaw clenched, the way his eyes narrowed just a fraction, it was all she needed to see. "That was too fast," she said, her eyes narrowing. "Text from Ethan?" His eyes shot up to her, sharp and sudden like a knife being drawn. "Careful, Sarah." Her smile was slow, dangerous. "Oh, I'm being careful, boss." She leaned forward, resting her elbows on her knees. "But maybe you should be too. That little twitch in your jaw. That look in your eyes. I've seen it before. You're not as untouchable as you think you are." John took a slow breath through his nose, exhaling through his teeth. He slipped the phone into his pocket and stepped around the coffee table, stopping in front of her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. His shadow stretched long across the floor, cast by the glow of the city lights behind him. He crouched down, elbows on his knees, his eyes locked on hers. "You're sharp," he said softly, tilting his head. "But sharp things break. And when they do, they shatter." She didn't blink. "Then you better watch where you're standing when I do." For the first time, John's smile disappeared completely. No smirk. No smug look. Just silence. His eyes studied her, really studied her, and for the first time, she thought he might actually be seeing her for what she was. Not a pawn. Not a desperate woman. A player. He stood slowly, his gaze never leaving hers. "Get some sleep, Sarah," he said quietly, stepping past her toward the hallway. "Tomorrow's going to be a long day." "Don't worry, Reynolds," she called after him. "I don't sleep much anyway." He paused, glancing at her over his shoulder. His eyes lingered on her for a beat longer than usual. Then, without another word, he walked down the hall and disappeared behind a door, leaving her alone in the glow of the skyline. Sarah sat there for a while, the hum of the city filling the quiet. Her eyes stayed on the hallway where he'd disappeared. She drummed her fingers slowly on the arm of the sofa, her eyes sharper than ever. "He's slipping," she thought. "Ethan's in his head. I'm in his head. He's used to being the one in control, but now he's got too many players on the board." Her hand drifted to her belly, fingers pressing softly against the curve. "You see that, baby?" she whispered quietly. "They think they're kings, but I've been playing this game longer than them." Her eyes flicked to the skyline, to the thousands of tiny lights flickering across the city. She stared at them, each one a reminder of all the nights she'd fought to survive. "Kings fall too," she muttered. The lights outside flickered. The world kept moving. And Sarah? Sarah was ready to play. The sky over New York was a deep shade of gray, thick clouds swirling like a storm brewing just beyond the horizon. The air inside the penthouse was just as heavy, tense with something unspoken but impossible to ignore. Sarah stood by the window, one hand resting lightly on her belly, her other hand pressed against the cool glass. Her reflection stared back at her, calmer than she felt. Her eyes moved over the skyline, scanning the endless stretch of skyscrapers, each window a little world of its own. She could hear faint sounds behind her, footsteps, the soft shuffle of paper, the low hum of John's voice as he spoke on the phone. Her eyes narrowed on the reflection of John, standing behind her at the dining table. He was pacing now, phone pressed to his ear, his tone sharp but controlled. "Don't give me excuses," he snapped into the phone, his voice low but lethal. "I pay you to have answers, not problems." He stopped pacing, his hand pressed against his forehead, fingers threading through his hair. "No, I don't care how complicated it is. You fix it." Her eyes stayed on him, watching every move, every twitch. His control was slipping, and she knew it. People like John Reynolds didn't like being backed into a corner, and right now, he was close to one. She turned her gaze back to the skyline, letting the sound of his voice fade into the background. The storm wasn't just outside. It was here. Moments later, she heard him hang up the phone with a sharp, aggressive tap on the screen. Footsteps. Firm. Purposeful. She didn't turn around. "You plan on staring out that window all day?" John's voice was behind her, sharp as ever. "Maybe," she replied, her tone light but firm. "Better view out there than in here." He didn't answer right away. She could feel him watching her, his eyes heavy on her back. She waited. She didn't flinch. "You have something to say, Sarah?" he asked, his voice cool but coiled tight, like a wire stretched too far. Her fingers drummed lightly against the glass. "Plenty." She turned slowly, her eyes locking on his. But I'm thinking it might be better to wait. John tilted his head slightly, his gaze narrowing. Wait for what? Her smile was slow and sharp. For you to stop pretending you have everything under control. His eyes darkened. He took a slow step forward, his gaze hard as steel. Careful, Sarah. Her eyes didn't waver. She tilted her head, matching his energy. No, you be careful, John. You're cracking, and people like Ethan. They smell blood in the water. His jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing to slits. Ethan's not a threat to me. Sure he's not, she said, crossing her arms, her eyes sharp as ever. That's why you've been on edge since he walked in here. His eyes locked on hers, and for a second, it felt like the whole room went still. Quiet. Heavy. But not peaceful. You think you know me? He said softly, his voice like a blade being drawn from its sheath. No, she replied, leaning forward, her gaze steady and unyielding. But I know men like you. You act untouchable until someone touches the wrong nerve. And right now, Ethan's doing a pretty good job of it. He moved quickly, faster than she expected. 1 second he was by the table, and the next, he was right in front of her. Close. Too close. She didn't move, didn't back down, even as he leaned in, his face inches from hers. You want to push me, Sarah, he said quietly, his eyes locked on hers. Go ahead. Push. But you better be ready for what happens after. Her heart pounded in her chest, but her face didn't show it. She'd stood face to face with danger before. This wasn't her first time. You think you scare me, Reynolds, she whispered, her eyes unblinking. I've faced worse men than you. Men who didn't have half your money but twice your cruelty. Her eyes flickered to his hands, then back to his face. If you're looking for fear, you're gonna be disappointed. They stayed like that for a moment. His breath was steady, but his eyes burned with something colder than rage. Control. Pure, raw control. He leaned back, his gaze still locked on hers. His lips curled into a slow, dangerous smile. Good, he muttered, stepping back. Fear makes people sloppy. Her eyes followed him as he walked away, calm as ever, but she didn't miss the tension in his shoulders. He picked up his phone from the table, his thumb hovering over the screen like he was thinking of calling someone. Who was it? She asked, her tone casual but her eyes sharp. On the phone. He glanced at her, but his eyes didn't give anything away. Business. Liar, she said simply, leaning back against the window. Her gaze stayed on him like a hawk watching its prey. You only get that look when it's personal. John let out a short laugh, shaking his head. You really think you've got me figured out, don't you? I think I'm getting there, she said, her voice quiet but firm. He turned, facing her fully now, his hands in his pockets. His eyes studied her, like he was seeing something new. Not a pawn. Not a problem. A player. You're smarter than I gave you credit for, he admitted. But being smart and being safe aren't the same thing. Don't worry, she said, her hand resting protectively on her belly. I've spent my whole life not being safe. I'm used to it. His eyes flicked to her hand on her belly, and for the briefest moment, something shifted in his expression. Something unreadable. Before he could speak, the sharp ding of the elevator echoed through the hallway. Both of them turned at the same time. The metal doors slid open slowly, and there he was. Ethan. He stepped out, his grin already in place, his hands in his pockets like he didn't have a care in the world. His suit was flawless, his tie slightly loosened like he'd just stepped out of a boardroom he owned. Miss me, cousin? Ethan said, his grin wide and sharp. His eyes flicked to Sarah. Hey there, Sarah. Still playing house? John's posture stiffened, his gaze locked on Ethan like he was ready to throw him through the nearest window. "What are you doing here, Ethan?" Ethan raised his hands in mock surrender, his grin never fading. "Relax, Johnny. Family can't stop by unannounced." He strolled toward the living room, his eyes scanning the space like he was appraising it. "Not this family," John muttered. Ethan chuckled, glancing at Sarah. "How do you put up with him?" he asked, flashing her that fake, charming smile. "I have a high tolerance for arrogant men," Sarah replied, eyes locked on him, her tone sharp as glass. Ethan's grin faltered for a second before he recovered, his gaze narrowing on her. "I like you," he said slowly, pointing at her. "You've got fire." "Careful," she said, tilting her head. "You might get burned." Ethan's grin widened, but it didn't reach his eyes. His gaze flicked back to John. "Word on the street says you've got a problem, cousin. Thought I'd offer my help." "No thanks," John replied, stepping closer. "I don't need help from snakes." Ethan's smile faded. His eyes stayed locked on John, cold and sharp. "Snakes survive, John. Rats drown." The room went quiet. John took another step forward, his eyes locked on Ethan like a wolf stalking another predator. His voice was quiet but filled with steel. "Say what you came to say, Ethan. Or get out." Ethan's smile returned, slower this time. He glanced at Sarah, then back to John. "Careful, cousin," Ethan said, his voice low and dangerous. "Storms don't always warn you before they hit." He took one last look at Sarah, his grin cold and calculated. Then he walked back toward the elevator. John didn't move. Sarah didn't blink. The elevator doors slid shut, and for the first time in a long time, neither of them spoke. The storm had arrived. But this time, it wasn't outside. It was in them. The soft hum of the elevator faded into silence, but the tension it left behind hung heavy in the air. John stood motionless, his eyes locked on the space where Ethan had been just moments ago. His jaw was tight, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, fingers curled into fists. Sarah stayed where she was, leaning casually against the window, her arms crossed. Her gaze flickered between John and the elevator door, her mind working like a machine with no off switch. She knew men like Ethan didn't show up just to talk. He came to stir the pot, and from the look on John's face, he'd succeeded. "Well, that was cozy," she said, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "Always nice when family stops by unannounced." John didn't reply. He didn't move. His eyes stayed on the door, sharp and unblinking. "Hey," Sarah said louder, pushing off the window and walking toward him. "You hear me, Reynolds?" He blinked once, his focus snapping back to her like a camera lens adjusting. His eyes met hers, colder than usual. "I heard you." "Good," she said, tilting her head, watching him like she was sizing him up. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like Ethan's got you rattled." His eyes narrowed. "I'm not rattled." Her lips curled into a slow, knowing smile. "Sure you're not?" She stepped closer, stopping just a few feet away from him. "But you're doing that thing again." His brow furrowed. "What thing?" She raised an eyebrow, tilting her head toward him. "The thing where you go all statue mode and act like nothing's wrong when you're actually 1 second away from blowing up. You think nobody sees it, but trust me, it's written all over you." John's gaze hardened, his posture rigid. "Don't act like you know me, Sarah." "Don't act like I don't," she shot back, folding her arms. "I've been around men like you my whole life. You don't scare me. I know what I'm looking at." They stared at each other in silence, tension curling through the air like smoke. "You think you're clever," he said quietly, stepping forward. Each step was slow, deliberate, his eyes locked on hers like a predator stalking prey. "But being clever gets people hurt." "Only if they play dumb," she replied, standing her ground. Her eyes never left his, and she didn't flinch when he got close. Close enough for her to smell the faint scent of whiskey and cedarwood on him. "And I'm not playing." They stood inches apart, their eyes locked in a silent war. His eyes searched hers, scanning for doubt, fear, anything. But he found nothing. "Smart girl," he muttered, his voice low and dangerous. He stepped back, eyes still on her. "Then you already know Ethan didn't come here for conversation." Sarah tilted her head. "Of course he didn't. He came to remind you he's still in the game." John snorted softly, his eyes flicking toward the window, watching the city below. "He's always been in the game. Difference is, now he thinks he's winning." Sarah's gaze sharpened. "And is he?" John didn't answer. Not right away. He just watched the skyline, his face unreadable, but his jaw stayed tight. His silence was louder than any answer he could have given. Her eyes narrowed. "He knows something, doesn't he?" John's gaze flicked back to her. "Drop it, Sarah." Her eyes didn't budge. Not a chance. She stepped forward, forcing him to face her head-on. "If he knows something, that means he's ahead of you. And if he's ahead of you, then I'm in danger too. So yeah, I'm not dropping it." His eyes flashed with something dangerous. "I said drop it." Her face didn't move. Her eyes didn't blink. She just stood there, defiance carved into every inch of her expression. "You know," she said slowly, her voice steady as stone, "you're good at control, John. But the thing about control is, it only works if everyone's following the script. And Ethan? He's rewriting yours." Her words hit him like a punch to the ribs. She saw it. The way his eyes flickered just for a second. He hated that she saw it, hated that she could read him that well. He exhaled slowly, rubbing the back of his neck. His eyes stayed on the window, but his shoulders finally dropped, just a little. "Ethan's always been a snake," he muttered, his voice quieter now, like he was talking more to himself than her. "He's been trying to get ahead of me since we were kids. This time won't be any different." "Unless it is," Sarah said bluntly. John's eyes shot back to her, sharper than a blade. "You're used to being on top, Reynolds," she said, stepping closer. "But it only takes one slip. One mistake. Ethan doesn't have to win, he just has to wait for you to lose." He stared at her, and for the first time, he didn't have a comeback. No snarky remarks. No clever insults. Just silence. She took a step back, folding her arms. "You think I'm being paranoid?" "Maybe," he said softly, his gaze still locked on hers. Her eyes stayed on him, steady, unblinking. "Yeah, well, paranoia kept me alive long before you came along." They stayed like that for a moment longer, neither one willing to break first. Then his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out slowly, his eyes narrowing as he glanced at the screen. Whatever he saw, it made his entire face shift. His eyes darkened, his lips pressed into a thin, hard line. "What?" Sarah asked, watching him closely. He didn't answer. He tapped the screen, opening a message. His jaw clenched as he read it. "John," Sarah said more firmly now. "What is it?" He finally looked at her, his eyes colder than she'd ever seen them. He turned the phone toward her. On the screen was a photo. A photo of her. Her heart stopped. It was a photo of her standing outside the penthouse entrance, from the night she arrived. She recognized the clothes, the hoodie, the rain dripping from her hair. She'd thought no one had noticed her that night. But someone had. Her heart started pounding in her chest, fast and sharp. She reached out and swiped the screen to scroll. There were more photos. Her getting out of John's car. Her walking toward the building. Her stepping inside. All of it. At the bottom of the message, there was a single line of text. Does she know she's being watched? Sarah's breath hitched. Her eyes flicked to John, and for the first time since she'd met him, she saw something new. Not control. Not confidence. Rage. His eyes stayed on hers, locked with a kind of intensity that could burn a hole through steel. Who sent it? She asked, her voice tight, quiet. John's jaw worked, his teeth clenched so hard she could hear it. He didn't say the name. He didn't have to. Ethan, she muttered, her eyes going cold as she stared at the screen. It's him, isn't it? John nodded once, slow and deliberate. Yeah, he said softly, his voice like distant thunder. It's him. They both stared at the screen, neither of them speaking. The air between them felt heavier than it had all day. The storm outside had passed, but the one inside was just beginning. Her fingers slowly curled into fists, nails pressing into her palms. She glanced up at John, her voice low, deadly. He's not just watching you, Reynolds, she said quietly. Her eyes flicked to the photo of herself on the screen. He's watching me too. John's eyes locked on hers, his voice like steel. Not for long, he muttered, his eyes narrowing. Not for long. The photo on John's phone stayed between them like a ticking bomb. Every second that passed felt heavier than the last. Sarah's eyes stayed fixed on the image of herself, soaked from the rain, walking toward the entrance of the penthouse. She remembered that night vividly. She'd thought no one had been watching. But someone had. Her heart pounded in her chest, but her face stayed still, her breathing slow and steady. Panic never helped anyone. She learned that lesson a long time ago. John, however, was different. His eyes burned with something raw, something dangerous. He stared at the screen like it had insulted him personally. His jaw was locked so tight that the muscle on the side of his face twitched. He's playing with you, Sarah said, her voice low but firm. Her eyes flicked up to meet John's. Sending pictures like that? It's not just a warning, it's bait. John didn't look at her right away. His thumb hovered over the screen like he was one wrong press away from smashing the phone into the wall. His eyes stayed sharp, cold, like a predator calculating the perfect moment to strike. Yeah, he muttered, his voice like gravel. He wants me to make a move. Wants me to slip. Are you going to? She asked, tilting her head, watching him carefully. He finally lifted his eyes to meet hers, and for the first time in a long time, there was no mask. No smug grin. No playful arrogance. Just raw, sharp clarity. No, he said, his voice low and deadly. He thinks he's smarter than me. I'm going to let him keep thinking that. Her eyes narrowed. You sure that's smart? Sounds like you're letting him take control. John's gaze didn't falter. Control isn't about reacting, Sarah. It's about timing. You don't punch a snake when it hisses, you wait for it to strike first. Her lips pressed into a thin line. That's cute, but while you're playing mind games with Ethan, he's out there watching me. She pointed at the phone. That's not just a warning for you, John. That's a threat against me. Against my baby. Her voice cracked just a little at the last word, but she covered it quickly, clenching her fists to keep control. She wasn't going to let John see her break. Not now. Not ever. His eyes flickered to her belly for half a second, then back to her face. His stare was steady, unblinking. I know, he said quietly, voice like steel. She stepped forward, closing the space between them. Her eyes stayed locked on his, fierce, unrelenting. Then you better do more than know, Reynolds. Because if Ethan comes for me, if he comes for my kid, you're going to see what happens when you back me into a corner. Silence. John tilted his head, his eyes narrowing, scanning her face for any sign of doubt. He found none. Noted, he said quietly, his voice calm but firm. "But I told you before, Sarah, I don't lose." "Neither do I," she shot back, stepping even closer. "So maybe it's time you stopped trying to play smart and started playing fast." His eyes flickered with something dangerous. His lips parted like he was about to fire back, but then his phone buzzed in his hand. Both of them froze. Their eyes dropped to the screen at the same time. A message. No name attached. Just a number. If she thinks she's safe with him, she's wrong. Sarah's breath hitched. Her eyes darted up to John, searching his face. For once, he wasn't stone-cold calm. He was still, but not calm. The kind of stillness that came just before a predator launched itself at its prey. His fingers moved quickly, tapping out a reply. Short. Precise. "Come find out." He hit send. "Seriously?" she hissed, her eyes wide with disbelief. "You just told him to come to us." John slid the phone into his pocket, his eyes cold and sharp. "No. I told him to think he's coming to us." Her eyes narrowed, her head tilting. "And what happens when he does?" John's eyes stayed locked on hers, his gaze unwavering. "He won't leave." The weight of those words hit hard. Sarah knew what they meant. No ambiguity. No half measures. Her heart thudded in her chest, but she didn't look away. "You really think you can pull that off?" "Ethan's not stupid, John. He's arrogant, yeah, but he's not stupid." John's smirk was slow, sharp, and colder than ever. "That's what makes it fun." Her eyes stayed on him, scanning his face for cracks, signs of doubt. She didn't find any, but something about the way he was smiling made her uneasy. She'd seen that look before, on men who thought they had everything figured out right before it all collapsed around them. "You're too calm," she said softly, her arms folding across her chest. "Calm men lose." He raised an eyebrow, his smirk still in place. "Angry men lose faster." Her lips pressed together into a thin line. "Arrogant men lose everything." His smirk twitched, but he didn't reply. Instead, he moved to the kitchen counter, pulled open a drawer, and pulled out a sleek black handgun. He checked the magazine, slid it back in, and chambered a round with a sharp metallic click-clack. Sarah's eyes followed every move. She didn't say a word. She didn't have to. "You expect him to come here?" she asked, her voice quieter now. "I expect him to be stupid," John replied, sliding the gun into a hidden compartment under the kitchen island. "But I'm ready if he's not." Her eyes stayed on him, watching the way his shoulders stayed relaxed, his breathing steady. He looked like a man who had done this before. She wondered just how many times he had. "All right," she said softly, her voice steady but firm. "If this is the plan, I'm in." His eyes snapped to hers, surprise flickering across his face for the briefest second. "You're in?" he repeated, like he wasn't sure he'd heard her right. "You heard me," she said, stepping forward. Her eyes locked on his, fierce and unblinking. "If Ethan thinks I'm a pawn in this game, then let him think that. Let him walk right into it. But I'm not hiding, John. Not from him. Not from anyone." His lips curled into something close to a smile, but it wasn't amusement. It was approval. "You're bold," he muttered, his eyes scanning her face like she was a blueprint he was trying to memorize. "Bold gets people killed." "Not if they're smart," she replied, her eyes cold and steady. He nodded slowly, his eyes locked on hers. "All right, Sarah. You want in? You're in." He leaned forward, eyes sharp as glass. "But understand this, if Ethan steps foot in this building, it's not a game anymore. It's war." Her eyes didn't waver. "I've been at war my whole life, John." Another long, heavy silence. Then, slowly, he reached into the drawer and pulled out another gun. A smaller one. Sleek, black, and compact. Without a word, he placed it on the counter in front of her. Her eyes flicked down to it, then back up to his face. "You said you were in," he said softly, his eyes sharp but calm. "Now prove it." Her eyes stayed on him, searching his face one last time. Looking for doubt. For hesitation. She found none. Without a word, she picked up the gun, turning it over in her hands like she'd done it 100 times before. Her fingers brushed against the cold steel, her grip steady. She glanced at him, her eyes sharper than ever. "Don't worry, Reynolds," she said quietly, her voice like ice. "I always do." They stood there in silence, two people who had once been strangers, now bound by something far more dangerous than trust. The storm wasn't coming anymore. It was already here. The storm had finally arrived, not outside, but inside. Thick tension hung in the air, sharper than broken glass and heavier than concrete. The skyline of New York shimmered beyond the vast glass windows of the penthouse, but neither John nor Sarah were looking at it. Sarah sat at the kitchen island, the compact black handgun resting on the marble countertop in front of her. Her fingers tapped lightly on the surface, her eyes fixed on the weapon like it was a puzzle she was trying to solve. Her thoughts moved fast, calculating every possible move Ethan might make, every mistake John might overlook. Across from her, John was on the phone, pacing slowly like a predator locked in a cage. His shirt sleeves were still rolled up, his forearms tense with barely restrained energy. His voice was low, sharp, cutting through the air like a blade. "I don't care if it's late," he snapped, his voice quiet but lethal. "I said I want eyes on him now. I want to know where he goes, who he talks to, and if he so much as breathes wrong, I want to know about it before he does." Sarah's eyes flicked up from the gun, watching him as he paced. She'd seen men like this before, men who lived their whole lives thinking they were untouchable. But John wasn't like them. He didn't pretend to be untouchable. He just was. And that was worse. Her eyes followed him as he ended the call, shoving the phone into his pocket with more force than necessary. He stood there for a second, breathing slowly, his eyes locked on the ground. "You good?" she asked, her voice cutting through the quiet. John didn't answer right away. He lifted his gaze to hers, and for a second, she saw it, the weight. Not fear. Not doubt. Just weight. The kind you carry when you've been playing a dangerous game for too long. "Yeah," he muttered, his voice rough but controlled. "I'm good." "Liar," she said bluntly, picking up the gun. She checked the weight of it, testing the balance. It felt lighter than she expected, but her grip was steady. She glanced at him, raising an eyebrow. "You're doing that thing again." His eyes narrowed. "What thing?" "The one where you act like you're 5 steps ahead but you're really only 2, she said, inspecting the gun like it was a toy. She flicked the safety switch off, her thumb moving with precision. "You think Ethan's coming through the front door, but if it were me, I wouldn't. I'd come through the back. Maybe the roof." John's eyes stayed on her longer than usual. His fingers tapped lightly against his leg, his mind working through the possibilities. "You think I'm not ready for that?" he asked, tilting his head, eyes locked on hers. "I think you're ready for everything you would do," she said, clicking the safety back on. "But Ethan doesn't think like you. He thinks like a man with something to prove." Her eyes lifted to meet his, sharp and focused. "And men with something to prove do stupid things." John tilted his head, his lips twitching with the ghost of a smile. "Is that what you do, Sarah? Come through the roof?" Her smile was slow, dangerous. "I'd come through the walls." His eyes stayed on her for a moment longer, like he was trying to read her mind. But all he did was nod once, slow and deliberate. "All right," he said quietly. "We do it your way." Her eyes widened just a fraction. She hadn't expected that. Just like that. John shrugged, his gaze steady. You're right. Ethan's not me. He's reckless, and reckless men aren't predictable. He walked over to the kitchen island, resting his hands on the edge of the counter, his eyes on hers. But if he's reckless, that makes him sloppy. And sloppy men make mistakes. Her gaze sharpened. Unless you mistake them first. He didn't reply, but she knew he'd heard her. He heard everything. John's phone buzzed again. This time, he didn't hesitate. He pulled it from his pocket, glancing at the screen. His eyes narrowed, his jaw going tight. What? Sarah asked, her voice sharp. John's lips pressed into a thin line. He turned the screen toward her. A new photo. This time, it wasn't Sarah. It was a shot of the building. The penthouse. Taken from outside. From below. Roof or back door, huh? He muttered, his voice low, dangerous. Her heart jumped, but her face stayed calm. She leaned forward, eyes locked on the photo. She scanned every detail, her mind moving fast. Look at the angle. This wasn't taken from the ground. She leaned back, eyes narrowing. He's already here. John's eyes shifted to the window, his entire body going still. Not tense. Not rigid. Just still. He glanced at Sarah, his voice quiet but firm. Go to the guest room. Lock the door. Her eyes snapped to his. No. Sarah, he said, his voice a little harder this time, I don't have time to argue. Then don't, she shot back, grabbing the gun from the counter and standing. She stepped closer, eyes sharp as razors. You put a gun in my hand, Reynolds. You don't get to tell me to run now. They stared at each other, unblinking, unmoving. Finally, John's lips curved into a small, dangerous smile. You're stubborn, you know that. Yeah, she said, cocking the gun, her eyes cold and steady. I also know how to aim. He glanced at her, then nodded once. All right. Stay close. They moved together, stepping lightly across the penthouse. John's eyes scanned every corner, every shadow, every possible entry point. He moved like a man who'd done this before. Every step calculated. Every glance purposeful. The air was colder now. Not from the weather. From something else. John moved toward the hallway, his footsteps silent. His eyes flicked up to the ceiling, scanning the air vents, the skylights. His fingers tapped lightly on the wall twice. A signal. Sarah moved behind him, her grip tight on the gun. Her breathing stayed steady, controlled. Her eyes didn't dart around wildly, she knew better. You only look once. You make it count. Where would you come in from? John asked, his voice a whisper. Roof, she muttered, her eyes on the skylight above them. Too many points of entry up there. Too many shadows. John glanced at the ceiling, his eyes narrowing. Then that's where we look. They moved like shadows themselves, silent and sharp. John pulled out his own gun, his movement smooth, practiced. He motioned for Sarah to stay close, his eyes sharp as glass. Suddenly, a faint sound. Tap tap. It was light. Soft. Too soft for anyone but them to hear. Sarah's eyes shot up to the ceiling vent. Her breath stopped. Her eyes locked on John, and he saw it too. His eyes flicked to hers. One look was all it took. They didn't need words. They both knew. He's here. John's eyes shifted to the door at the end of the hall, the storage closet. He motioned with 2 fingers. Go. Sarah's heart thudded, but her steps were steady. Quiet. She moved with precision, her body close to the wall, her footsteps barely making a sound. She kept her back to the wall, her grip on the gun firm. Her breathing was slow, controlled. John moved in the opposite direction, his eyes locked on the ceiling vent, his gun raised. Another sound. This time, it wasn't soft. It was sharp. Metal on metal. The sound of a vent grate shifting. Sarah's eyes locked on John's. He nodded once. Her heart pounded like thunder in her chest, but her breathing stayed steady. Her finger hovered over the trigger, her eyes locked on the ceiling vent. Another second. Another breath. Then, the metal vent dropped. Crash. A figure dropped down from the ceiling, landing hard on the floor. Sarah didn't think. She didn't hesitate. She lifted the gun, finger on the trigger. "Don't move," she barked, her voice sharp as lightning. The man crouched, his face hidden by a black hood. Slowly, he lifted his head. His eyes met Sarah's. And he smiled. "Hello, Sarah," Ethan said, his grin sharp as a knife. Her blood went cold. John's voice came from behind him, low and deadly. "Hello, Ethan." The grin vanished. Ethan froze. And then, slowly, he raised his hands. The silence was deafening. The kind that presses against your ears and fills your lungs with the weight of something inevitable. Ethan knelt on one knee, his black hood pulled back just enough to reveal his face. His cocky grin hung there like it had nowhere else to be. His eyes, sharp and calculating, darted from Sarah to John like he was already calculating his next move. John stood behind him, his gun raised, arms steady, eyes locked on the back of Ethan's head. No hesitation. No doubt. His breathing was so controlled, it was hard to tell if he was even breathing at all. Sarah didn't move. Her gun was raised, both hands steady, her eyes fixed on Ethan's face. She didn't blink. Didn't flinch. Her heart was pounding in her chest, but her hands, steady as steel. "Hands up," John's voice was low, calm, and cold as the steel barrel of his gun. Slow. No sudden moves. Ethan chuckled, the sound dry and full of arrogance. "Come on, cousin," he said, glancing at John from over his shoulder. "You think I came all this way to surrender?" He tilted his head, eyes glinting with amusement. "That's not my style." "Hands up," John repeated, his voice quieter but somehow more dangerous. Slowly, Ethan raised his hands, fingers spread wide. His grin didn't fade. It didn't even falter. All right. Hands up. See?" He wiggled his fingers like this was all just some big joke. "No need to get jumpy." John's eyes didn't move from Ethan's head. "On your feet." Slowly. Ethan raised one eyebrow but followed the order. He rose slowly, his movements precise and controlled, like someone who knew how close he was to having a bullet put in him. Once he was fully upright, he stretched his neck from side to side, letting out a soft pop, pop. "Man," Ethan said, rolling his shoulders. "You two are tense. Feels like a party in here." His eyes flicked to Sarah. "Didn't know you had it in you, sweetheart. Gotta say, you wear it well." He nodded toward the gun in her hand, his grin as wide as ever. "Look at you. All grown up." Sarah's eyes narrowed, her grip on the gun tightening. Her breathing stayed slow, steady. She didn't take the bait. "Shut up," she said, her voice sharp as broken glass. "One more word and I put you back on that floor." Ethan's eyes flickered with something darker for just a second. Amusement gone. Something colder taking its place. "Ooh," he said softly, eyes locked on hers. "Spicy." "I said shut up," Sarah snapped, stepping forward. The barrel of her gun stayed trained on his chest, unwavering. Her voice didn't rise, but it hit harder than a shout. "You think this is a game? Keep talking and see how fast it ends. John's eyes flicked to Sarah for just a second, watching her closely. He didn't say a word, but there was something in his gaze. Not surprise. Not concern. Respect. Ethan tilted his head, his grin slowly fading. His eyes focused on Sarah like he was seeing her for the first time. "All right," he said quietly, his tone shifting from playful to something colder. "All right, I see you, Sarah." He said her name slowly, like it tasted different on his tongue. "Not just a pretty face, huh?" "Keep testing me," she said, her eyes locked on his. "See how that works out." Another second of silence passed. No one moved. No one breathed. Then Ethan laughed. Quiet, but real. "I like you," he said, glancing back at John. "You always pick the interesting ones, don't you, cousin?" John stepped forward, gun still raised. His eyes were colder than ever. No emotion. Just focus. "You have 10 seconds to tell me why you're here, Ethan," John said, his voice slow, deliberate. 9. Ethan's grin widened. "Really? A countdown, John? You think that's gonna scare me?" 8, John said, not blinking. Ethan's eyes flicked to the gun, then back to John's face. His grin faltered just a little. Okay, Ethan said, his hands still raised. "I came to talk." 7. "I'm serious," Ethan said, his tone sharper now. "I'm not here to fight. I'm here to talk." 6. "John," Ethan said louder, his grin gone now, replaced with something harder, more desperate. "I'm trying to help you." 5. "Damn it, John," Ethan snapped, his eyes flashing with anger. "Do you really think I'm stupid enough to come here without a plan?" 4. Ethan's breath came quicker now. His eyes darted around the room, scanning, calculating. His chest rose and fell with each breath, faster than before. 3, John said softly, his finger on the trigger. Okay, Ethan barked, raising his hands higher. "I'm here because I know something you don't." 2, John's eyes narrowed, finger steady on the trigger. "Your grandfather's turning on you." Ethan blurted, his eyes wild now. "You think you're playing him, but he's playing you, John." Silence. John didn't lower his gun, but his eyes shifted, just for a second. His gaze flickered with something sharp, something raw. "Keep talking," John said, his voice dangerously quiet. Ethan let out a breath, lowering his hands slowly. "He doesn't want you to win," he said quickly, his eyes darting between John and Sarah. "This whole have an heir clause. It's not about legacy. It's about control. He wants you to fight me, to burn everything down, and when you're both too broken to stand, he takes it all." "Liar," John muttered, his eyes locked on Ethan. "Call me a liar all you want, cousin," Ethan said, taking a slow step forward. "But you know I'm right." He raised an eyebrow, tilting his head. "Tell me something, John. Has he been calling you more lately? Checking in on your progress?" He grinned, his teeth sharp as knives. "Yeah. Thought so." John's finger twitched on the trigger, but he didn't shoot. Sarah's eyes flicked to John. She saw the doubt. The hesitation. She'd seen it before, that moment when the ground underneath you shifts just a little, and suddenly, you're not sure which way is up. Her eyes darted back to Ethan. "Why tell us?" she asked, her voice cold. "If you know all this, why not use it for yourself?" Ethan's grin returned, slower this time. "Because I don't need to. All I have to do is wait." He glanced at John, his grin widening. "The old man's already got his hooks in you, cousin. You just don't know it yet." John's eyes didn't waver, but his jaw clenched tighter. "You came all this way to tell me that?" "No," Ethan said, his eyes sharp as ever. I came here to see if you'd figure it out before it's too late. Another silence. Heavy. Thick. John lowered the gun slowly, his eyes locked on Ethan like a wolf deciding if its prey was worth the chase. "Get out," John muttered, his voice low but deadly. Ethan tilted his head, his grin as sharp as ever. "I was just leaving." He backed up toward the elevator, hands still raised. "See you soon, cousin." His eyes flicked to Sarah one last time. "Take care of yourself, sweetheart." Sarah didn't flinch. Her eyes stayed on him, her face cold as stone. The elevator doors slid shut. The second they closed, John slammed his fist against the wall, the sound like thunder. The whole room shook. His breathing was heavier now, controlled rage seeping out with every breath. Sarah lowered her gun slowly, eyes still on him. "Tell me you don't believe him," she said quietly. John didn't answer. His eyes stayed on the wall, his hands pressed flat against it. And for the first time since she'd met him, Sarah saw it. Doubt. And doubt. Doubt was dangerous. The echo of John's fist against the wall lingered like a distant clap of thunder. The marble was flawless, uncracked, but the same couldn't be said for him. His back was still to Sarah, his hands pressed flat against the wall as he leaned forward, head bowed. He didn't move. Not for a long time. Sarah stood a few feet away, her gun lowered but still in her hand. Her eyes stayed locked on him, scanning his body language. Shoulders too tight. Breathing too shallow. He's spiraling, she thought. She'd seen it before, men who thought they were unbreakable until someone showed them the cracks. "Tell me you don't believe him," she repeated, her voice low but firm. She wasn't asking this time. She was demanding. John didn't answer. His fingers pressed harder into the wall, his knuckles going pale from the pressure. His head tilted forward, chin to his chest, and for a second, she thought he might snap. But when he finally spoke, his voice was steady. Too steady. "Does it matter if I believe him?" he muttered, not turning around. His tone was cold, hollow, like he was talking to himself. "Believing him doesn't change the fact that it could be true." Sarah's eyes narrowed. She stepped forward, her steps slow, deliberate. "That's a dangerous place to be, Reynolds. Doubt makes people stupid. People get reckless when they're stupid." "Yeah," he muttered, turning his head just slightly, his eyes catching hers from the side. "They do." They stared at each other in that moment, eyes locked in silent understanding. "You think your grandfather's playing you," she said flatly, stepping closer. Her voice was quiet, sharp, like a scalpel cutting to the heart of it. "You think all of this, the air, the competition with Ethan, it's all one big setup." John pushed off the wall slowly, turning to face her. His eyes were colder than she'd ever seen them, sharp and ruthless like shattered glass. "I know it is." Her breath hitched, but she didn't show it. She took another step forward, keeping her eyes on him like he was a live wire about to spark. "Then why haven't you done anything about it?" she challenged, tilting her head. "You're supposed to be the one who's always 5 steps ahead, right? But right now, it feels like you're chasing his shadow." John's eyes flickered, but his face didn't change. His silence was louder than any argument he could have made. "Thought so," she muttered, looking away for a second before locking eyes with him again. "You can't win this by playing his game, John. If you play it his way, you lose." His eyes narrowed. "You think you know how to win, Sarah? Go ahead. Tell me." Her lips twitched into a small, dangerous smile. "Stop playing defense. Stop reacting. You want to win. Take control." He raised an eyebrow, his arms folding slowly across his chest. "And how do you suggest I do that?" "Simple," she said, stepping even closer, her eyes sharp as knives. "Make him doubt you." He's been watching you, pulling strings, making you dance. So give him something to watch. But this time, you control the show. John tilted his head, eyes narrowing in thought. You want me to fake it? Put on a show. Exactly, she said, her eyes locked on his, unflinching. Make him think you're following his script, but write your own ending. She tapped her temple with her index finger. People like him, they get so focused on controlling everyone else, they don't notice when someone's controlling them. He let out a low chuckle, shaking his head slowly. It wasn't amusement. It was something colder, something sharp and deadly. You're dangerous, Sarah, he muttered, his eyes cutting back to hers. Her grin was slow and deliberate. I told you that the day we met. Silence settled again, but this time, it felt different. Before, it had been tense, like two fighters circling each other. Now it felt like something was shifting. Like two pieces of a plan were clicking into place. John nodded slowly, his eyes distant, focused on something only he could see. All right, he said quietly, his voice like a thread of steel. We flipped the board. Her eyes narrowed. How? He stepped past her, walking toward the kitchen island where he'd hidden his gun. His movements were slower now, more deliberate, more controlled. Every step had purpose. Every breath was calculated. He pulled out his phone, tapped a few buttons, and pressed it to his ear. It's me, he said calmly, his tone back to that cold, calculated control she'd come to recognize. Move the accounts. All of them. I don't care how clean you think they are, make them cleaner. By tomorrow morning, I want them untraceable. He paused, listening for a moment. His eyes flicked to Sarah, watching her closely. Yes. All of it. He ended the call and slid the phone back into his pocket. Money moves fast, Sarah, he said, walking toward her slowly. Faster than people. Faster than threats. And when it's gone, people notice. Her eyes flicked with understanding. You're cutting him off. John nodded. If Charles wants control, he's gonna have to do it without my cash. That's a good start, she admitted, her arms folding. But cutting off the money only works if you have something to follow up with. If he thinks you're just running scared, he'll tighten the leash. John smirked, his eyes narrowing with sharp amusement. You think I'm running scared? I think you've been running since the second he sent that letter, she shot back. Her eyes didn't waver, not for a second. The question is, when are you gonna stop running and start fighting? John tilted his head, eyes scanning her face like he was seeing her for the first time. His smirk widened just a fraction, colder than before. Soon, he muttered. Real soon. The air between them shifted. Not just tension. Not just strategy. Alignment. Two people who'd been circling each other, now stepping in sync. His phone buzzed again. He pulled it out, his eyes flicking to the screen. His entire face shifted. What? Sarah asked, her voice sharp, alert. He stared at the phone for a second too long. Long enough for Sarah to see it. His jaw tightened. His grip on the phone turned white-knuckle tight. What? She repeated, stepping toward him. John turned the screen to face her. It was another photo. This time, it wasn't of her. It was of a hospital. A small, plain-looking clinic, nothing fancy. But she recognized it instantly. Her heart stopped. The clinic where she'd had her last checkup. The timestamp was from today. Her breath came short and fast, her eyes darting to John, then back to the screen. Beneath the photo, another message. Didn't think I'd find this, did you? Her stomach turned to ice. Ethan, she whispered, her voice barely a breath. Her hands clenched into fists so tight her nails dug into her palms. He's been following me. John's eyes lifted to meet hers, his gaze sharp, focused. "No," he said quietly, his voice calm but deadly. "He's been following both of us." Her eyes met his, and in that moment, she knew. This wasn't just a game of control anymore. It wasn't business. It wasn't family politics. This was personal. John lowered the phone slowly, his eyes distant but sharp, like he was already 10 steps ahead. "All right," he muttered, his voice like the crack of thunder before lightning strikes. "No more waiting." Sarah's eyes narrowed, her heart steadying. "So what's the plan?" He glanced at her, his eyes cold and clear. "We stop reacting." Her eyes locked on his, fierce and steady. "And start what?" John's lips curled into a slow, dangerous smile. "Hunting." The word hung in the air like smoke. No more playing defense. No more watching and waiting. It was time to strike. The dim glow of the city skyline seeped into the penthouse, casting streaks of blue and amber light across the marble floor. But inside, there was no warmth. No calm. Only the quiet hum of war brewing beneath the surface. John Reynolds stood at the kitchen island, his phone in one hand, his other hand tapping slowly, methodically, against the cold marble countertop. Each tap echoed like a countdown. His eyes were locked on nothing, his gaze distant but sharp, like he was watching every move on a chessboard only he could see. Across from him, Sarah sat at the edge of the sofa, her elbows on her knees, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. She was watching him, her eyes narrowed with focus. She knew that look. She'd seen it before on men just before they made the kind of decision they couldn't come back from. "Say it," she said quietly, her voice cutting through the still air like a blade. John's fingers paused mid-tap. His eyes slowly shifted to her, his gaze so sharp it could slice steel. "Say what?" he asked, his voice low, steady. "Say what we're both thinking," she replied, leaning forward. Her fingers drummed softly against her knee. "This isn't about winning anymore, is it? It's not about the will. Not about heirs. This is about him." John didn't answer right away. He just stared at her, his jaw tight, his eyes calculating every possible response. But Sarah wasn't backing down. "Not this time. You're not hunting for control," she continued, her eyes locked on his. "You're hunting him. You're done playing nice. Done playing by the rules." Her words hung in the air like smoke. Heavy. Dense. Impossible to ignore. "Yeah," John muttered, his eyes dark with certainty. "I am." His fingers curled into a fist on the countertop. He glanced at the phone still in his other hand, his jaw tight as if every muscle in his face was ready to snap. "No more moves," he muttered to himself. "No more patience. No more giving him space to play." He exhaled slowly, his eyes flickering with something dangerous. "We take it all from him. Everything." Sarah leaned back slowly, letting the weight of his words sink in. She wasn't sure which version of John she preferred, the cold, calculated one or this version. The version ready to burn the whole board to ash. Her gaze flicked to the phone in his hand. "You're gonna make a move, huh?" she asked, tilting her head. "Big one." "Biggest one," he replied, lifting the phone in front of him. His thumb hovered over the screen for a second. His eyes stayed on hers as he asked, "You in?" Her answer was immediate. "I told you before, Reynolds. I don't run." His lips curled into a small, dangerous smile. "That's what I like about you." With one press of his thumb, he made the call. He put it on speaker, letting the soft buzz of the dialing tone fill the room. 3 rings. Then, a voice. Familiar. Calm. But not friendly. "John," Charles Reynolds' voice echoed from the phone, smooth as silk but heavy with command. "It's late. This better be important. John's eyes didn't move from Sarah's. His stare was sharp, unblinking. "Oh, it's important," John replied, his tone razor-sharp. "Thought you'd want to hear it directly from me." A pause on the other end. A pause too long to be casual. Charles knew something was coming. He just didn't know what. "Go on, then," Charles said, his tone still calm, but there was a slight edge now. "I'm listening." John's eyes never left Sarah. He tilted his head slowly, his gaze like a hunter closing in on prey. "Effective immediately, I'm freezing every account under Reynolds Holdings," John said with surgical precision, each word slow and deliberate. "All liquid assets are being transferred to private offshore trusts under my control. You'll have access to nothing." Silence. Not static. Not a breath. Nothing. Then, Charles chuckled softly. It wasn't humor. It was something colder. "Bold move, boy," Charles said, his tone like the rumble of distant thunder. "But a reckless one. Do you really think I didn't see this coming?" John's eyes flicked toward Sarah, and for a moment, there was that quiet flicker of doubt. But it didn't last. He leaned forward, resting both hands on the counter, eyes narrowing. "Doesn't matter if you saw it," John replied, his voice colder than ever. "What matters is that it's done." Silence again. This time, longer. He could hear the faint tap, tap, tap of fingers on a desk. Charles was thinking. Calculating. "You think you've won," Charles muttered, his voice quieter but twice as dangerous. "You think cutting me off is a victory. But you forget one thing, John." John tilted his head. "What's that?" "Men like me," Charles said slowly, his tone sharp as broken glass, "don't need money to win. We only need time. And you, my boy, are out of it." Click. The call ended. John pulled the phone away from his face, staring at the blank screen. His jaw flexed, his fingers curling around the phone tighter. "Yeah," Sarah muttered, her eyes still on him. "He's pissed." "Good," John replied, tossing the phone onto the counter like it was nothing. "Let him be pissed." Silence filled the room again. Not calm silence. Charged silence. Like something was about to explode. Sarah glanced at John, her eyes sharp and steady. "So, what now?" John rolled his shoulders back, letting out a slow breath. "We get ready." "For what?" she asked, her eyes narrowing. He walked to the large glass windows that overlooked the city. His eyes scanned the skyline like he was looking for something only he could see. "For war," he muttered, his voice low but certain. "Ethan's coming. Charles is coming. And they're not coming to talk." Her lips pressed into a thin line. She nodded slowly, her eyes flicking toward the hallway where she knew the storage closet was. She'd seen the extra guns in there. She knew where the safe was too. "All right," she said, standing slowly. Her body moved with purpose now, her mind already locking into the next phase. She glanced at John one last time. "But if they're coming for us, we don't wait for them." John glanced at her, his eyes sharp with approval. "No," he agreed, his voice like a growl. "We take the fight to them." She nodded once, her eyes colder than they'd ever been. She didn't need a plan from him. She didn't need orders. She knew exactly what to do. "Then let's stop talking," she said, turning toward the hallway. Her voice was steady, sharp as steel. "We've got work to do." John watched her go, his gaze lingering on her back. His eyes didn't soften. They hardened. He reached down, pulled open the hidden compartment under the kitchen island, and pulled out a second gun. He checked the magazine, chambered around, and slid it into the holster on his back. His eyes stayed on the city beyond the glass. New York never sleeps, they said. But tonight, it would watch. No more patience. No more defense. This wasn't about heirs anymore. It wasn't about family legacy. This was personal. And John Reynolds had never been more ready to burn everything down. He stared at the city one last time, eyes cold, heart steady, mind sharp. "Come on, Ethan," he muttered quietly, his breath fogging the glass for just a second before it vanished. His eyes narrowed, sharp as a blade. "I'm done waiting." The rain started to fall again, soft at first, tapping against the glass like tiny fingers. It would be louder soon. Heavy. Relentless. But by then, it wouldn't matter. Because when the rain came down, so would everyone else.